Well, you may find it interesting that I'm talking about why God is necessary to make sense of evil when the problem of evil is the most used argument against God's existence. So what we want to do is point out how if you get rid of God, ultimately, the problem of evil becomes not only worse, it becomes impossible. And so we'll unpack some of those things in our discussion today. You may have heard about Katy Perry's comments in light of the May 2017 Manchester bombing. She said this on a talk show: "The greatest thing we could do is just unite and love on each other, and like no barriers, no borders. We all need to just coexist." Well, this kind of a response to profound evil is hard to know what to do with that kind of a comment. You could appreciate the desire to be united and so forth, but what happens when people don't want to be united? They want to engage in ways that are harmful and terrorizing. As we look at the problem of evil, what I want to do is look at it in this way, that we want to talk about the very recognition of evil, recognizing that there is evil within us and also evil outside of us. It's not something that can be papered over or dismissed out of hand. But there are people who do that. There are people who repudiate the very notion of evil, that it's somehow non-existent, that it's an illusion, that it's not real. And so we want to talk about that in various manifestations. We also want to talk about what the definition of evil is, to kind of get a handle on understanding this better. And I think once we understand what the definition of evil is in a very basic way, it will help us to process this in our own minds and also to engage with those who are unbelievers, those who think that evil is to be used as an argument against God. Then we want to look at the explanation of evil. We want to look at the logical and probabilistic problems of evil, and then the resolution to evil, salvation and judgment. So that's our basic outline for this next hour plus of discussion. So let's jump in by talking about, first of all, the recognition of evil that we see in the world around us as well as within each of us. There is evil to be confronted. Let's talk first about the evil in the world around us. We look at some of these pictures and we readily recognize horrific scenes. In my own family, my grandfather died in the Holodomor, the hunger plague in Ukraine. And my father, who died last April, 2 Aprils ago, he had been a pastor of a Russian-Ukrainian church in Cleveland when I was growing up. But he was born in Petropol in Ukraine. And so he was one who experienced evils in his own upbringing. A few pictures from our family there. A dear, joyful man. Whenever you'd ask him, you say, "Pop, how are you doing?" He'd say, "Praise the Lord." He'd give that fist pump, and or he'd sometimes say, "Żyjemy, we live." And that was his demeanor. He had come through so much, but yet there was such joy in his life. But in his own experience, he had been, his family had been evicted from the farmhouse in which he had grown up. There's a drawing that a watercolor that my father had done of the home in which he had grown up. These communist radicals came in the middle of winter. My grandfather, Andrei, was arrested, put into a labor camp, and he would eventually die of starvation because of the Stalin-induced famine. And so my father, in his own experience, saw death and destruction during the Second World War. He was pressed into service to dig trenches for the German army, and would be pulling dead bodies or the wounded into trenches, and eventually would make his way, during all of this, found his way to God, found peace with God, and became a follower of Jesus Christ. And it was this evil actually was a means of bringing him to faith in Christ. But we see other expressions of evil. We think of what happened in Bosnia. Eleanor Stump, a philosopher, recounts this in her essay, The Mirror of Evil. A young Muslim mother in Bosnia was repeatedly raped in front of her husband and father, with her baby screaming on the floor beside her. When her torment seemed finally tired of her, she begged permission to nurse the child. In response, one of the rapists swiftly decapitated the baby and threw the head on the mother's lap. Eleanor Stump writes, "This evil is different, and we feel it immediately. We don't have to reason about it or think it over. As we read the story, we are filled with grief and distress, shaken with revulsion and incomprehension." The evil outside of us. But there's also evil within us. C.S. Lewis spoke about this as he, for the first time, looked at his own inner life with scrutiny. In his book, Mere Christianity, he writes, he actually in another essay, but he wrote, "For the first time, I examined myself with a seriously practical purpose, and there I found what appalled me: a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. My name was Legion." There are many of us, as Legion pointed out to Jesus when Jesus was face to face with this demoniac in Mark chapter 5. But C.S. Lewis recognized the matter of evil within. It's very easy to talk about evil being out there, but a lot of people don't talk about the evil within. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Soviet dissident, author, prisoner, says, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. The line shifts inside us. It oscillates with the years. Even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil." Good to be reminded of these things. Elie Wiesel, Nobel Prize laureate and human rights advocate who survived Auschwitz, he reflected on the evils that he saw, and he said, "Deep down, man is not only an executioner, not only a victim, not only a spectator, he is all three at once." Again, good to be reminded of this, someone you'd think, oh, we were all the victims, but recognizing that there is great potential for evil within each one of us. And so it's good to be reminded of these things from those who had been on the other side of the barbed wire, as it were, who were experiencing these things in imprisonment conditions. Despite all of this, there are those who repudiate the notion of evil, both in the East as well as in the West. I mean, we just read that quotation by Eleanor Stump, and we recognize evil as a properly basic category. It's something that we spot, we recognize. Doesn't mean we can sometimes get it wrong, sure. But I think overall we have a fundamental understanding that evil exists. In fact, it's reinforced, the reality of evil is reinforced by atheists who will want to put that into our faces and say, how can you explain the existence of God if there is all of this evil in the world? Now, evil comes in differing degrees, and we can talk about common wrongdoing, such as cheating on an exam, to a more profound wickedness. And here's a list of evils given by the Christian philosopher Marilyn McCord Adams. She She said, I offered the following list of paradigmatic horrors: the rape of a woman and axing off of her arms, psychophysical torture whose ultimate goal is the disintegration of personality, betrayal of one's deepest loyalties, cannibalizing one's own offspring, child abuse of the sort described by Ivan Karamazov, like a mother who beats her 7-year-old girl or a 5-year-old boy forced to sleep outside and eat excrement, child pornography, parental incest, slow death by starvation, participation in Nazi death camps, having to choose which of one's children shall live and which will be executed by terrorists. I regard these as paradigmatic because I believe most people would find in the doing or suffering of them, prima facie or on the face of it, reason to doubt the positive meaning of their lives. So if you need some examples, here they are. Some people might say, oh, I don't really believe in good and evil, and we'll get to some of those people. I think it's just good to say, do you really believe that torturing babies for fun is wrong? Or do you think that it's okay? I think it's just good to ask those sorts of questions. And I think that there's often a lot of self-deception that goes on when people repudiate or deny what seems so obvious to right-thinking, morally directed persons. Some worldviews, unfortunately, deny the reality of evil. You hear the monkeys, the speak no evil, see no evil, hear no evil. Originally, this Confucian or Japanese wise saying about not participating in evil in any way. But in the West, it's become a maxim for refusing to acknowledge evil. And we see that in the East. There's a book, The Lotus and the Robot, by Arthur Koestler, who interviewed a Zen Buddhist scholar at the International House of Japan, the chair for comparative religion there. And this was how the conversation went. Buddhism lays great stress on truth. Why should a man tell the truth when it may be to his advantage to lie? Because it is simpler, said this man. Somebody took another tack. You favor tolerance toward all religions and all political systems. What about Hitler's gas chambers? Now get this. That was very silly of him. Hitler's gas chambers, just silly, not evil. Just silly, not evil? Evil is a Christian concept. Good and evil exist only on a relative scale. So here we have, in certain versions of Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion, a repudiation of the very notion of evil. Evil is sometimes seen as, in one school of Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, it would be seen as an illusion. If you talk about good and evil, this distinction itself it tells us that you're thinking in opposite categories. That is just illusory, because the ultimate reality, this pure consciousness, Brahman, is this undifferentiated oneness. Remove all logical thought, remove all subject-object distinction, remove all emotion, and you just have this pure consciousness. That is the only reality that there is. If you believe in any good and evil dichotomy or division, that just shows that you are unenlightened in your thinking. Evil is just an illusion. That's how it is in some some Eastern schools of thought. But we also see it in, say, a Western naturalistic view. Richard Dawkins, he says, if the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, it would be neither good nor evil in intention. He says, if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, that is what we've got in this kind of a world that we observe. He says, DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So that's the sum total of good and evil, just dancing to our DNA. You may not like it, but we're just dancing to our DNA. Bertrand Russell, another British thinker, talked about how we are the products of causes that had no prevision or preview of the end that they were achieving. such blind processes that our origin, our growth, our hopes and fears, loves, beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations or arrangements of atoms. And he mentions that the whole temple of human achievements must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of an unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. So no real good or evil, no dividing lines. It's just accidental arrangements of atoms here. So we didn't come from Adam, we came from atoms. And that's just the sum total of it. Now, I would put this forward, that those who deny what seems so obvious to us when it comes to evil, when it comes to the reality of these terrible, horrific things, these paradigmatic horrors that Marilyn Adams talks about, those who reject them have a burden of proof. Why do you reject what seems so obvious to so many people, whether they're theists or atheists, that recognize these sorts of things as profoundly evil, things that ought to be resisted, things that should be stopped, etc. Rather than dismissing them, I think we ought to press them a little bit and say, I think there's some more of a burden of proof here than to deny that Hitler really wasn't evil, or that there's no difference between Hitler and Mother Teresa. So, let's move on now to this question of the resolution to eat. No, this is not right. We need to move to I think this is the definition of evil here. Yeah, sorry about that. I'll have to correct that. There's something profoundly wrong with this world. Moral evils, the flawed human condition, natural evils, and so forth. Interestingly, science doesn't really give us any guidance. Some people say, prove to me scientifically that evil exists. Why should I have to do that? Science is very limited in what it can deliver. We would ask the people who think that only science can give us answers, we have to ask the question, how can you scientifically prove that all knowledge must be scientifically provable? You can't. You see, science deals with various physical processes and phenomena and so forth. But it doesn't tell us about whether human beings have purpose in life, whether there is such a thing as human dignity, whether the soul exists, etc. This is just beyond the realm of science. But why think that science has to explain everything? That's a very limited view of looking at things. Science only tells us something. It doesn't tell us everything. But yet there are, so people who think that they've got to be scientific at explaining evil, they're not going to get very far. Science, on what scientific basis can we come up with a way a person ought to act? I mean, we think of somebody like Hitler. Science can describe Hitler's background, his anger, etc., but can't prescribe what Hitler ought to have done. How do we move from the way things are to the way things ought to be? You see, science just tells us about the way things are. It doesn't tell us how we ought to behave. It doesn't tell us what our duties are. So the reality of evil, moral value, human dignity, and so forth, these are just beyond being able to prove something scientifically, but that's okay. Lots of things we take for granted that can't be proven scientifically. In fact, we'll use logical laws that can't be proven scientifically. In fact, to do science, we have to use logical laws in order to conduct our experiments and draw conclusions and so forth. And that's okay. But science isn't everything. C.S. Lewis spoke about evil in this way. He says, my argument when he was an atheist against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? So unjust, kind of like crooked, presupposes some sort of a standard, like straight or good. Or, maybe more helpful, counterfeit money. You see, you can have in counterfeit money. In order to have counterfeit money, you've got to have the real currency. Without real currency, counterfeit money makes absolutely no sense. You can have goodness without evil, but you can't have evil without goodness. Evil depends, in a sense, on goodness, from which we judge something to be a deviation. So when it comes to a definition, we can talk about evil as being a departure from the way things ought to be. This presupposes a kind of objective standard, a design plan, a blueprint for the way what ought to be. So for the atheist, what ends up happening is it turns out to be two problems that need to be faced. Two problems. The problem of evil. You see, every worldview has to come to terms with evil. It's not just the Christian. A lot of atheists think, though, oh, you've got the burden of proof. Tell me about how evil and God make sense. I'm saying the atheist also has a problem with goodness. How do you deal with goodness in a world of selfish genes and electrons? Although atheists use the argument from evil against God, what we need to keep in mind is that atheists need to understand that they have to deal with the problem as well. That they're assuming, one, the reality of evil, and that means that they're presupposing the way things ought to be, that there is a design plan, a standard from which evil is a deviation. So let's look at two problems of evil that are articulated by atheists in order to better understand, one, what the issues are, and secondly, how to respond to them. So we'll talk about the logical problem of evil and then the probabilistic problem of evil. As I said, every worldview has to grapple with evil. And the question is, which worldview does the best job of addressing evil? Which worldview has the best resources available to come to terms with the vast range of evil and offer a response to it? Does it mean that we have everything nailed down and that there are no questions remaining at the end of the day? No. But what we ought to do is say, okay, this is how I understand evil. This is how I address evil. How does your worldview actually come to terms with this? And as I've said, once you get rid of God, and especially the God revealed in Scripture, it becomes impossible to deal with the problem of evil in this robust way that I'm talking about. So let's proceed then in talking about the problem of evil. There's one issue that I should address, and it's the emotional problem of evil. Right now I'm in correspondence with someone who has given up on the Christian faith, and I would say that this person has, I wrote to this person saying, I think the problem is more of an emotional issue than it is an intellectual one. I don't think you really have questions about God's existence per se. I think that there are a lot of emotional issues that need to be addressed in your life. And I said, and I also told this person, if you get rid of God, I think you're only making the problem worse. Evil becomes a nonsensical category without God as the standard. So when there is an emotional argument, some people will get mad at God. They will raise their voice. They'll get angry. Sometimes when I'm speaking to people and they get angry about God, I want to pull back a little bit and say, it's hard for me to argue against your anger. So it might be helpful for me to know why you are actually angry about this issue. Probe a little bit. There's often a question behind the question. There's often there's often baggage. There's often the emotion. There's often negative experience that when you meet the atheist with the chip on his shoulder, where there's real anger and hostility, you can bet that he wasn't reasoned into his atheism through argument, but rather it comes through a series of emotions and experiences that have led him to this conclusion, this situation, a state of mind. So let's not ignore the emotional dimension, but it's not an argument. The emotional problem of evil is real, but again, it's not an argument itself. Sometimes it may just require pastoral care, personal presence, and so forth. It's going to involve less of an argument than it will personal presence and concern for a person, and perhaps counseling and so on. So let's look at those two arguments. The logical problem of evil first. According to the Oxford philosopher, J.L. Mackie, died back in 1984, I believe. But 81, sorry. His book came out in 84. But the argument was that God is omnipotent, or all-powerful, and that God is wholly good, and that evil exists. But he says the problem for the theologian is that he cannot hold to all three of these statements simultaneously. So it's a necessary argument. In other words, if you have each of these three statements, it involves a logical contradiction. So this is known as the logical problem of evil. There are two faulty assumptions in this argument. The first assumption is this, that a good being eliminates evil insofar as he can. Some people think, oh, that sounds reasonable. Get rid of as much evil as you can and so forth. Well, what if it's possible that certain evils are permitted in order to achieve certain ends that maybe aren't known to the people experiencing evil? We may not even know what those reasons are. What if those morally sufficient reasons exist? Now notice what happens. If you add, so we've got those three statements, God is all good, God is all powerful, evil exists. If we just say, fourth, God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil, then basically it's game over for this argument. Indeed, that's what many have come to recognize, but we'll get to that in just a moment. So that's one false assumption, that evil has to be eliminated if a being is to be considered good. That being, if he can pull it off, if he can do it, that being ought to eliminate all evils. Well, maybe it's a matter of, if there are certain evils, maybe it will lead to the eradication of that evil may lead to greater evils. Maybe there are certain evils that come because of the goodness of the good gift of human free will. Which brings us to our second one, the second assumption. There are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. Well, what if this being creates free creatures who can go in the direction of goodness or evil, but then every time they act, if it's toward evil, then somehow God cuts that short circuits the process so that they never actually carry out evil acts? Well, maybe this would be a big problem if we're talking about genuine free will. So there may be, we can talk about certain limits, not that God doesn't have all power, but when he creates free creatures, he engages with them. He respects those choices of free creatures, indeed incorporates those free actions of his creatures into the fulfillment of his purposes. So God works with human free choices and doesn't override them. So we have serious question about these two assumptions by J.L. Mackie. But philosophers, even on the atheist side, have recognized that the logical problem of evil is pretty much dead in the water. William Rowe, an atheist philosopher, died recently. He said, some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. There's an atheist speaking. And William Alston, noted Christian philosopher, says it is now acknowledged to be, on almost all sides, that the logical argument is bankrupt. So this is pretty much, as one philosopher said, this has been consigned to the dustbins of philosophical history. So people who bring this up think that there's an automatic contradiction. Frankly, they aren't up on the literature. This has pretty much been recognized on all sides to be dead. But this brings us to another issue that isn't so dead, the probabilistic problem of evil. A good God, even though it's logically possible that God and evil could coexist, it's unlikely, it's improbable that a good God would exist in the face of all the evils that are abounding. Think of all of those lists that I gave you, those things that we've just talked about earlier on. So even though, again, you've got a point on the logical argument, it's still highly improbable that God exists. But how do we respond to these sorts of things? Well, the argument, to kind of set the pace here, to set the tone for us, goes like this from the probabilistic point of view. If God exists, he wouldn't allow any utterly pointless evil. There probably is pointless evil, so probably God doesn't exist. So what about that issue of these pointless evils, sometimes called gratuitous evil? Well, what may be helpful here is to first of all rework the argument. Consider another way to look at it. First, if God exists, he wouldn't allow any pointless evil, but God does exist, and therefore there is no utterly pointless evil. How about that? What some person takes as a starting point, we can actually, if God is in the picture, see it in a different light. A second response is to reassess the scope of evidence. Notice that we're just looking at the problem of evil. And if we're just looking at the problem of evil, it seems less likely that God would exist. But we have to consider the full scope of the evidence, not just the problem of evil. So here we've got things like the beginning of the universe. The universe began to exist a finite time ago. We have very good reason for thinking there's something that exists independent of the universe. Or the fine-tuning of the universe. Everything is so precisely tuned for life. Or consciousness. How did consciousness come out of non-conscious matter? Or rationality. How did thinking, rational thought, come from non-rational processes? How did beauty come from all of this, from these accidental arrangements of atoms? What about human dignity and moral duties? What about even the evidence for the historical Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus? These are all part of the bigger scope of evidence. So when we're talking about probability, we have to ask, what do you mean by probable? In light of what evidence are we talking about? You've got a stronger point if you're just looking at evil, but even so, you haven't looked at the bigger picture, the broader scope of evidence. A third point is this, to reconsider your position. If you're using this probabilistic argument from evil against God, we have to ask, are we actually in the best position to determine whether evil is unnecessary? Do we really know that? How would we know that that these evils that we see, at least to us that don't have a purpose, that they actually do not have a purpose? I mean, we're just not in the best position to make that kind of a claim. What if evil is not this evil is not gratuitous, but maybe it's just inscrutable or mysterious to us? You see, it doesn't follow that if we don't understand the reason for this evil, that there can be no reason for that evil. It doesn't follow. I mean, think of trying to understand, I can't figure out that Albert Einstein guy. He must be wacky, he just must be crazy. Well, just because I can't understand it doesn't mean that there isn't sense to what he is saying. Maybe the problem is with me. Maybe it's my limited understanding. So reconsider your position. Maybe say, am I really in the best position to make this kind of an assessment? Also, we can maybe even relinquish on this question of gratuity or gratuitous evil. Let's just say there are gratuitous evils, that there are unnecessary evils. Notice that it still does not negate the fact that, one, there could be a general reason for permitting evil. C.S. Lewis said that evil is pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Maybe God has a purpose to allowing evils in general, even if we can't, or even if a specific reason can't be pinpointed for every evil along the way. Maybe there's a general reason for it. Secondly, the very notion of evil itself presupposes a standard. That there is a position that we need to reinsert the design plan here. That if we are talking about evil, whether it's gratuitous or purposeful evil that's been permitted by God, we still are assuming that there is a design plan, that evil is a deviation from the way things ought to be. So just to talk about the category of evil presupposes that design plan. Let me now move to this question of the resolution to evil. I think we'll have enough time for your questions, and I think this is a topic that generates a lot of questions. So the resolution to evil, salvation and judgment. I want to argue in this final section that without God, there is no standard to judge anything as evil, as we've already seen. Secondly, there is no significance to anything. I'll unpack that. It's very general, but we'll unpack that. Without God, there is no salvation from evil. And finally, without God, there is no solution to evil. To get rid of God only makes matters worse. So let's go back to that standard issue. Without God, there is no standard to judge anything as evil. We've already talked about C.S. Lewis and how he saw the universe as cruel and unjust. He goes on from there to say this: if the whole show of the universe was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. The Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga makes the same kind of comment. He says, could there really be any such thing as horrifying wickedness if naturalism, that is the view that nature is all the reality that there is, if naturalism were true? I don't see how. A naturalistic way of looking at the world, so it seems to me, has no place for genuine moral obligation or duty of any sort. All the more, then, it has no place for such a category as horrifying wickedness. The problem is one of understanding how, in a naturalistic universe, there could be such a thing as genuine and appalling wickedness. There can be such a thing only if there is a way rational creatures are supposed to live, obliged to live. But naturalism cannot make room for that kind of normativity, that kind of standard. That requires a lawgiver, one whose very nature is to abhor wickedness. Naturalism can perhaps accommodate foolishness and irrationality, acting contrary to what you take to be your own interests. It can't accommodate appalling wickedness. There's a picture of Alvin Plantinga. It looks like he's contemplating evil there, the topic of evil. Accordingly, if you think that there really is such a thing as horrifying wickedness, that our sense that there is not a mere illusion of some sort, as some Eastern views hold, and if you think that the main options are theism and naturalism, then you have a powerful theistic argument from evil. Notice what Alvin Plantinga is doing here. He's turning the argument against God into an argument for God, because this argument of evil against God makes no sense unless you have this kind of standard. Evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. And we've seen that the naturalist has those two problems, the problem of evil and the problem of goodness. So evil turns out to be an argument for God's existence. If objective moral values exist, then God most likely exists. Well, evil exists, and evil is an objective but negative moral value. Therefore, God most likely exists. That's how the argument works. Now, second point here in the conclusion is, without God, there is no significance to anything. Notice that the problem of evil raises certain questions about value. It takes things for granted about about things that should not be done, things that ought to be preserved, like human life and so forth, and perhaps even animals as having rights and so forth. Well, without God, none of this makes any sense. Why think that anything, humans or animals, have any significance if we've come from insignificant, valueless processes? Even if you hold that that animals have rights like human beings do, I disagree with that. We have responsibilities with regard to our stewardship, not because animals have rights in themselves, no more so than we ought to preserve certain things like the redwood forest or the sequoia forest in America. They're beautiful, and I don't think that trees have intrinsic rights or something, but it would be an abuse of our stewardship to cut all of those trees down rather than to preserve their beauty. But if we're the products of these molecules in motion, why think that anything has value, that anything should have rights bestowed upon them by a government? The notion of human rights, however, make excellent sense if God exists, if we're made in God's image and so forth. The emergence of valuable human beings in the universe is highly probable if there is this supremely valuable being, but again, highly improbable if there is no God. Furthermore, without God, there is no salvation from evil. In the Christian faith, God, as we said, gets his feet dirty, gets his hands bloody, steps into history to redeem and restore. God faces injustice in the person of Jesus Christ in order to bring restoration for humanity. I like the way Timothy Keller puts it. He says, if your fundamental is a man dying on the cross for his enemies, if the very heart of your self-image and your religion is a man praying for his enemies as he died for them, sacrificing for them, loving them, if that sinks into your heart of hearts, it's going to produce the kind of life that the early Christians produced, and we'll talk about that later. The most inclusive possible life out of the most exclusive possible claim. There we come to pluralism there, right? And that this is the truth. But what is the truth? The truth is a God become weak, loving and dying for the people who opposed him, dying, forgiving them. This is God's address, his addressing the human condition by giving himself for us, recognizing that we had nothing to stand on. There's no way to get ourselves out of our misery. Alvin Plantinga says, as the Christian sees things, God does not stand idly by, coolly observing the suffering of his creatures. He enters into and shares our suffering. He endures the anguish of seeing his Son, the second person of the Trinity, consigned to the bitterly cruel and shameful death of the cross. Some theologians claim that God cannot suffer. I believe they are wrong. God's capacity for suffering, I believe, is proportional to his greatness. So without God, there is no salvation, no rescuing us from our miserable condition. And without God, there is no solution to evil. A lot of people complain about the doctrine of hell. However, that's to be understood. We've had a little bit of discussion on that. But yet they complain about the injustice in the world. The very doctrine of hell, or however that's to be understood. We can unpack that. This self-chosen separation from God presupposes that God is going to address this problem of evil in a very distinctive way. Think about earthly justice. We think that if you let rapists and murderers go out onto the street, that there is something fundamentally wrong with a justice system. It is right in a society for us to bring these people to justice, to hold them to account for their actions. We hold this to be the case with regard to earthly justice. How much more so with cosmic justice? You see, unlike atheism, the existence of a good God guarantees that justice is going to be carried out, that wrongs are going to be put right. No one is going to get away with murder. Self-sacrifice for God and for others is not in vain. You see, there is a divine guarantee that comes with the biblical God, that virtue and ultimate happiness will come together, that there will be, some people, think of Mother Teresa, who sacrificed so much in the streets of Calcutta, But yet she felt such a darkness of soul, as her letters recount. If there is no God, all of Mother Teresa's labors in that darkness, again, for nothing. There is no reward. And for those like Hitler and Stalin, again, murders millions of times over. If there is no God, again, those murders go unaddressed. There is no fundamental justice if there is no God. But God guarantees that all of these things are going to be put right. And atheism fails to bring to us those resources that we need in grappling with these sorts of issues. So again, we've looked at the recognition of evil. We've looked at the repudiation of evil in East and West. We've looked at the definition of evil, which presupposes a design plan, and the explanation of evil, the logical and the probabilistic problem of evil, and then the resolution to evil, that if you get rid of God, you fundamentally are left in a worse position to account for, to make sense of, to have the resources to address this very deep problem of evil.